You've discovered the Technoprogressive Hub. Join us to fight for a high-tech and radically democratic future. My name is James Hughes. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies, and this is the kickoff podcast and vlog of our new Technoprogressive Hub project, a project that we actually started a year ago, which is an attempt to pull together people who think in terms of technoprogressive ideas and put together a political agenda around those. And I'll be introducing shortly my two collaborators on this project, Ellie Zupnik and Matteo Rossi. But this initial podcast is an attempt to frame for you what we are trying to do with this project and why we think it's so important right now. The obvious reason is the political moment we're in globally, that for the last 10, 15 years, there's been an erosion of democracy, an erosion of our ability to control the onslaught of technological change. And part of the erosion has been connected to the rise of tech oligarchy, the rise of data-based systems of power and wealth that we think are going to be increasingly central to structuring politics in the future. And so that we need to have many discussions and many fights about data privacy and rolling back some of the ways that data is structuring our lives. But there's also a moment here over the last, say, 25 years of the growing political disillusionment with the left on the part of, first, its traditional blue-collar base, which were people who became, in some cases, disillusioned with the way that social democratic parties had adopted the culture and mores of the middle class as they shifted to a middle-class base of support. And I think part of the answer that we are looking for from technoprogressive politics is to think about ways that a future-oriented vision that actually promises abundance, economic growth, various answers to economic precarity will address the growing blue-collar disillusionment, now I think increasingly with right-wing politics as well, since the right wing has reached a certain apogee, hopefully, in its erosion of democracy. But there's also a technological moment that we're responding to, which is that many people just these last couple of weeks in the tech firms and AI firms have begun to express that they really see 2026 as a watershed moment for the economic impacts that we have long expected from artificial intelligence, from automation, and that those will begin to manifest this year in ways that will be very politically destabilizing as well as technologically abrupt. And that we see firms already saying, people in firms, computer programmers in firms saying that they've eliminated their own jobs by using these new tools. And so we need to see how that's all going to play out this year, how we can create a vision of what a radically high-tech future with these tools, with these technologies would look like. So we would like to create a discussion around the ideas, the political bones of a program that would unite the center left and the progressive left, in not just in the United States, but in many countries around the world, to move forward and past this fascist moment globally. So I'll turn it over to my collaborators, and first I'll introduce Ellie Zupnik, and this is Ellie approached me more than a year ago about working on this project, and we started to pull together essays, and we will eventually be pulling together conferences, and we'll talk in a minute about that. We're pulling together a course with Matteo. But Ellie, why don't you introduce yourself?
Sure. Thanks, James, and thank you for hosting this and for launching and driving this effort over many, many years and all the work that you've done. So as James said, I'm Ellie Zupnik. I am not an academic like James, not like Matteo. I come from democratic politics and political communications. I spent 10 years in the United States Senate, worked on campaigns across the country for Democratic candidates. And for the past 6 years, I've been consulting for advocacy groups, nonprofits, companies, and others helping them with strategic communications, politically adjacent work, and that kind of work, accomplishing their goals in the political space. So the reason I'm focused on this right now is that, like James said, and I very strongly agree, we're living in this moment where technology is reshaping everything. It's moving faster and faster. It seems out of control at times. And from my perspective, the left right now is spending so much time engaged in this debate over how it wants to approach it, whether it wants to shape it, whether it wants to be a part of making sure that this technology works for everyone, or whether it wants to hide from it or stop it or slow it down. So there is just so much fear on the left right now. When I talk to people, when I do my work, and just when I see what's going on in the world, I see so much fear on the left when it comes to technology. And so much of that makes sense, of course. Big tech has concentrated power. There's a lot of harm that's being done by technology. There's a lot of harm that's being done by big tech. There's a lot of consequences, both intended and unintended, from the massive changes that are underway and the massive changes that are coming. But from my perspective, too often that fear turns into a focus on that slowing down, that stopping, instead of really trying to embrace what can be good about technology and what we can do to make sure that technology serves the progressive agenda that we care about. So for me, this project and what James's work and everything that we're doing here is about pushing past that and getting progressives and getting the left to a place where we can be comfortable talking about this and comfortable owning it and comfortable offering those kind of ambitious solutions that right now are too often lacking. So I'm interested, as I said, in what it looks like for progressives on the left to be truly ambitious about this agenda, to talk about all of the issues that James mentioned: AI, automation, energy, innovation, and so much more, not as threats to be contained, but as tools that can be governed, shaped, used to make people's lives better and achieve some of those progressive goals that we care about. Obviously, that doesn't mean blind optimism. It certainly doesn't mean just trusting the tech companies or even trusting them at all. But it means that technology can and should play an important role in accomplishing our progressive goals, and that we in our democracy and people should have something to say about that future. It shouldn't just be the big tech companies, and it certainly shouldn't just be the right that defines what the future looks like, with the left just saying no. So again, as I mentioned, I come from a communications background, and on this podcast here in this project, I approach these questions primarily from a political and communications angle: how ideas land, why certain stories or future visions feel exciting, why they feel frightening, how the left can talk about these issues, how we can talk about what we care about, talk about what we're fighting for, without sounding either naive on one hand or defensive on the other. And on this front, when it comes to political communications and politics in general, the stakes are very high right now. James talked a little bit about that. I'll talk about the politics specifically. Democrats may win in 2026. We may win in 2028 simply by opposing what's happening right now with President Trump and the rise of his authoritarian agenda and the harm it's causing to so many people, the economy. We may win, but that's not enough. It's critical, but it's not enough. I think that progressives and the left, Democrats, cannot just win. We could do more than just beat Trump, beat the Republicans for what they're doing to this country. We can reclaim the mantle of the future and show voters, show people across the country that we have a bold, inspiring vision that addresses the challenges that we're facing today, that fights back against what Trump is doing and pushes back against this agenda that's hurting so many people. And I think more and more people are turning against, but also gives that purpose, that vision, that possibility for tomorrow, without just saying we're going to bring back yesterday. And to me, this is what the techno-progressive vision is all about. We'll talk about this a whole lot more over the course of this podcast and in the future. But to me, techno-progressivism is not about, it's not a detour from progressive values. It's not something new or different. It's their modern expression. I feel strongly that if you believe in empowerment, equity, human flourishing, all of the progressive values that so many of us on the left share, we shouldn't run from technology. We shouldn't try to bring back the past, glamorize the past, and pretend that everything was great before we had these technologies and without the technologies that could come. We want to fight to make sure that these technologies serve everyone. We want to make sure that we have a politics and a government that that accommodates these technologies and makes sure it works for everyone. And we want to work for the left to own what could be an incredible future if we do it right. So again, before I wrap up here, I want to thank James for his work on this. His book, Citizen Cyborg, has shaped so much of my thinking, his writing, his podcasts, and other work. And thank you again for inviting me on.
Fantastic. And we also want to flesh out these ideas, not just the political framework that we want to work with and promote, but also the philosophical and sociological ideas underlying what we're proposing. And Matteo comes at this from that more academic angle, and we'll be teaching a course that we'll be announcing shortly that you can register for, a course that will start in mid-June, go through August, on technoprogressive thought and some of the contemporary policy issues that we need to address. But Matteo, why don't you introduce yourself?
Thanks, James and Ellie. Yeah, as James said, I'm in academia. I'm a PhD student, so at University of New Mexico, and I've been teaching and researching here for 6 years. I'm also a union organizer here in UE, the United Graduate Workers, and my angle is primarily first around labor. My dissertation project is on the tech workers movement. And so I really always start all of my thinking from labor and from a not just labor as in wage labor, but like how things are made, how they're designed, what the process is of making something, the kinds of organizations that produce those things is my starting point with everything, including technology. So when I think about technopolitics and technophilosophy, I'm always thinking about how it's made, what is the process, what's the design, what kind of organizations are making technology, what kind of values do they have, how do those values get embedded in technologies and technological systems, and in the kind of regulations and rules that can govern technology. And so whenever I think of the word techno, as in techno-progressivism or techno-fascism or techno-authoritarianism, depending on who you ask, what word is best to describe the present moment, I don't really think about it as something separate, like it's a different kind of fascism or a different kind of authoritarianism. And I don't think about techno-progressivism as being separate from progressivism or from the, which or like the social democratic or democratic socialist project. It's really the how these things, how these different politics and how these different practices and designs get expressed through technology. So when we think about techno-fascism, I'm always thinking, what is the technological embodiment of this political project, right? And that means that it's quite old. Fascists in the past, the in the American sense with the Jim Crow South, I think is one of the older fascist projects, and it's really very important for our moment now is a revival of the Jim Crow South. And in Europe with Germany and Italy, techno-fascism exists back then too. They used technology to spread their propaganda through the radio, through film, very particular ways that they communicated their messages. Those very modern and new technologies at the time were extremely important to spreading the fascist movement, and especially in Germany. The way that the propaganda was carried out using the latest technologies was really state of the art in terms of building a, what's it called? To building a consensus amongst the people that fascism was their project. And not only that, but how the war was carried out, how World War II was carried out, the ways that various other aspects of the fascist project were carried out had technological elements to them. And those things have always been true about political projects since the beginning of time. So we're really seeing now the use of these technologies that we have, social media, using artificial intelligence, LLMs, and various other aspects of interconnectivity on the internet how people can be brought into the fascist project, into MAGA specifically in the United States, through a kind of consensus that is now breaking down, luckily, and we hope that it continues to break down. But as Ellie said, it's not enough to just wait for it to break down. I think that's an important difference between the kinds of projects that are just anti-fascist only in a negative sense, right? Which is a very important. We want to end this political project. It is doing an immense amount of harm to people around the world, and it could do far more harm. I mean, we're only seeing a small part of what it could do if it's not resisted. So that's very important. But I'm always reminded of, now I'm teaching, I'm hopefully going to be teaching a course on Star Trek, and there's a lot of anti-fascist thinking in Star Trek and a lot of themes in the show, but primarily people remember the show for its world building and what it presents as coming after the society that we now live in, right? It's really a critique of our world, but it's not a critique that's just only a negative critique. It's very much a positive critique. It shows what is possible if a progressive worldview, many people call Star Trek socialist, and I think that in some ways it does express a democratic socialist view. But what would that world look like is a really important thing. And I think technoprogressivism is really concerned with this question because we, on the one hand, have to fight against what exists, the monopolization of technologies and their use for very dangerous political projects, and then also present a positive vision for how we imagine not, how we imagine the progressive and democratic socialist movements, the social democratic movement, as it's building up its, you know, argument for what comes after. We also have to think about how it's going to come, right? We can argue for abundance, universal abundance for people. We want everyone to have housing. We want everyone to have health care. We want everyone to have access to these things. But those things can only be delivered with technology, and not only with existing technologies, but also with new technologies. So how does that happen? That's a very important question that we cannot really afford to allow the right to answer, right?
I just to riff off of that, because I think we should expand a little bit on what technoprogressivism means to each of us, but just to riff on what you just said about the technological prehistory of fascism. It reminds me of the fact that one of the first applications of IBM punch cards was being used by the Third Reich to keep track of the population, which included who they were going to send to death camps. Now, the point is not that IBM punch cards created the death camps. And I think a lot of the left gets stuck on this. It's like, oh, fascists are using social media algorithms to control our reality. Social media algorithms must be evil, or fascists are using AI to get rid of jobs. AI must be evil. Instead of looking beyond that and saying, okay, if we were to have a democratic Europe and not a fascist Third Reich, what would the application of IBM punch cards be in that society, right? To manage social security payments or whatever, with the things that we ordinarily use them for in democratic societies. So we need to be looking beyond this moment. But I would say I usually start the story of technoprogressivism historically by saying it goes all the way back at least to the 18th century, because it's a story of the Enlightenment. It's about the fact that people who came up in the Enlightenment were part of a broad discussion across many countries and many decades. But one of the things that they were discussing was, what is the relationship between science, reason, and technology, the promises of intellectual modernity, and the political challenge of creating societies governed through the consent of the governed and relative political equality, democracy, liberalism, political equality, and eventually economic equality as a demand of that. So bringing those two things together, the values of the political Enlightenment with the values of the techno-optimistic Enlightenment, is that techno-progressive moment. Now, those things, as Ellie pointed to, I would argue, were the dominant strain of progressive thought, of anti-authoritarian thought, and of redistributive thought for 150 years until World War II. And World War II was really, for me, an inflection point because I wasn't there, but for those who were there, because we had the bomb. After that, we had the environmental movement. We had the counterculture, which raised many critiques of the technological direction of society. We had philosophical trends like postmodernism, which critiqued the narratives of progress, all of which are important things that we all need to know and incorporate their critiques into our own. But when you come out on the other side, it's like, do we still believe in anything? Do we still think that there's a direction? We may not want to say, like Lenin did, that communism is socialism plus electrification. That's obviously not true. But we also don't want to just throw out the idea that the future could be better through technological innovation, and that technological innovation is a part of human self-empowerment. So for me, that's really where the story starts. Back in the Enlightenment. But Ellie, what is the core idea of technoprogressivism for you?
Yeah, and again, going back to this, I'm approaching this a little bit more from the political and communication side, and as I see it, I think of that famous Bill Buckley line where he said that conservatives exist to stand athwart history, yelling "Stop." And for most of modern history, again, with the caveats that you lay out and the critiques that you lay out, progressives were the opposite. We believed that the future could be better than the present. We wanted to propel forward in a way that that actually made sense, that we believe that science, technology, democratic government could dramatically improve people's lives, and that we should go for progress. I mean, we are progressives, and that it was our job to make sure those benefits were widely shared. So as I see it, much of the left for much of our recent history, when it came to our politics and how we talked about what being a progressive was and what we could do, we were politically progressive and we were techno-optimistic. And this belief powered some of the greatest achievements of the last century, driven by progressive visions: vaccines, electrification, the internet, space exploration, disease eradication, everything, so much of what we're seeing right now. And that because technology wasn't separate from the progressive project, it was central to it, not unfettered, not just let it to just rip, but governed and done in a democratic way. But as I mentioned before, and we'll talk more about this, something shifted in the past few years, and a lot of the left has moved from being forward-looking and optimistic about what we could accomplish if we did this right, to being more defensive, narrow, constrained, what they're talking about, and what they think we could accomplish. And again, so much of that is understandable. The backlash against technology didn't come from nowhere, and it's important to take into consideration. Big tech, concentrated power, prioritizing profit over the public good, damaging trust, all the harm they've done. These are not insignificant issues. But the result, what I see as a problem, is that what too many progressives took from that is that they have taken a movement that once built the future to become seen in so many ways as technology skeptics, who are more focused on what technology can break and who it could harm than on what it could build, and who are more comfortable talking about defending the status quo or glamorizing the past and protecting what we have than articulating an affirmative vision of what could come next if we can actually do this right. I think that's a problem politically. I think that's a problem substantively, because as James Matteo talked about, we don't just have problems now, but so much of the future is going to be shaped by technology, whether we like it or not. And I think there's a lot that we should want to like about this. AI, automation, clean energy, biotech. Whether you believe that these things are inevitable, or whether that you believe that these things can be stopped, but maybe shouldn't be stopped if we do it right. The question to me is, who shapes it? To what end? What are we doing these for? And then how can we present that vision? So again, I guess just to sum up, James, to your question, techno-progressive vision starts from the idea that the path to a more equitable, prosperous, democratic, and happier society runs through and with technological progress, not around it, and not just simply by stopping it. So I'll stop there for now.
Matteo, last week, the British Labour government, which is now in deep doo-doo over the Epstein files, but the Labour government was attempting to get ahead of some of the technology news and released what they called a pro-labor AI agenda, which included giving workers more control over the pace of automation and the way that automation will proceed, but also some visions about ways that it could facilitate worker co-management and worker empowerment. But my son's a labor organizer, and I've talked to him often about the challenge of trying to convince workers who are in the path of the steamroller that there is a techno-progressive promise on the other end. And I think this has always been a problem, but all the way back to the Luddites. The reason we fight over this term Luddite is that on the one hand, the Luddites were absolutely correct that they were going to be steamrolled by capitalism and technological innovation. And their responses we support and we understand, but they didn't have access to the tools that we have access to today. Social democratic parties that could, through democratic governments, implement social welfare state reforms, and that those are much better ways to respond to technological unemployment than smashing machines. So as you think about techno-progressivism in the context of the labor movement, how do you frame what the appeal should be to the worker who's in the way of the steamroller?
Well, that's a good question, and it's not a very easy question to answer. These are very difficult things to control, right? Because I think most workers rightfully understand that the labor movement has weakened over the last few decades. And so when they think about controlling something like Apple or Google, these huge companies that have trillion-dollar valuations, and they see the state of the labor movement, they just don't have a lot of confidence that they can control it. But I would say, just to back up for a second, to think about how we think about techno-progressivism, it's really, I think, important to really define what technology is. And for me, I always define as from the labor perspective, that technology is the embodiment or crystallization of labor, right? This is in Capital Volume 1 and many other Marxist texts, but there's nothing that we can think of in the world that was not designed by and built by workers dating back centuries into the past. So the question is always who controls that labor? How is that labor directed? And political projects are really all about that, how we direct that labor. So when you have a fascist political project, specifically in the United States, it's a reactionary nationalist project, or it's a, sort of people call it Christian nationalist, or it's patriarchal in some way. There's a variety of different cultural projects attached to the political project of fascism that are different in different countries. And really, at the core, what they're trying to do is direct the labor of society, en masse toward realizing and actualizing the world that they seek. And there's a lot of, barriers to doing that. It's not so easy. It's not so straightforward. You can't just direct labor like with the click of a finger, which is to our benefit, because the especially because the people who are running these projects are not themselves really involved in the fine details of how society runs, so they don't quite understand how these structures and institutions operate, what the actual work of the people in any of the places, for instance, in the United States where Doge was eliminated, they don't, or sorry, where Doge eliminated an institution or some branch of an institution, they may not have any idea what kind of work was done there and what they're really eliminating. But in each of these institutions, they're embodying their labor in a system or in tools, right? In these institutions, it's typically like a mental labor being embodied in a set of rules or technical codes, and they regulate how society operates. And then in the factory and in other services, they're actual physical goods where labor gets embodied in a new machine, or where you build out the internet by laying cables and whatnot, and that labor is then reproduced every time you use the internet, right? So the question is always, how is that labor being redirected? When we have a progressive project, we're thinking about how can we democratize that process? How can we democratize how labor is directed, and how can we draw in people who are directly involved in that process to, determine its futures? That is the base of techno-progressivism, is to ask the question of the people who actually design and make technologies, I think at all levels of how technology is made. What kinds of futures do we really want to have? And I think that's really the basis of all democratic projects, right? If we want to have, one of the things, right, we want to have universal healthcare in the United States, which we're still fighting for after many decades. When they built the NHS in England, the original architects of that project believed that it should be jointly managed by people who are patients, doctors, other healthcare workers, and and various experts, right? It should be kind of partially controlled by experts, partially controlled by people who were directly affected by the system, partially controlled by workers in that system. So it's all different kinds of labor determining how healthcare is carried out, right? And the same thing for artificial intelligence, for automation. How should we direct this enormously powerful technology, which has all this promise, and direct it toward the kind of futures that we want? Because at the base of it, it was that labor, and maybe not directly in this current generation, but past generations of laborers and present generation of laborers that built all these things. So it should really be them who, and really us, right? All of us with all of our different kinds of labor, deciding how we want to run society. And I think that's at the basis of what a democracy is. And I think we make that argument, which is really a classic, democratic socialist argument, that we should have representation when we go about building our society, right? Shareholders have representation. The ruling class obviously has representation in all their institutions. So the workers should also have representation. The communities that are affected by these technologies should have representation. And I think that's really at the core of rebuilding the labor movement, is pushing it back toward its original basis of, you know, a democracy is also a democracy at work and a democracy of production.
Mhm. Well, one of the things I think we need to put on the table here is, because you just framed very much the kind of argument that I grew up with in DSA. I was a DSAer until very recently, Democratic Socialists of America. And the ideology in DSA from the 80s onward was that democratizing society was the project. And that we started with the assumption of liberal democracy, and then we wanted to extend liberal democracy into the workplace and the economy and so forth. And that's very much the kind of framework that I agree with. But there are folks on the center left who have a different frame of mind. And one of the things that's bubbled up out of the center left, Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson this last year, has been the abundance argument, which many people on the center left find appealing because it addresses the tangible and inignorable history of failure of Democrats over the last 30, 40 years of getting actual stuff done. We wanted to build high-speed rail, we wanted to build housing, we wanted to build all these things, and we had our heart was in the right place. But because we were so invested in a form of democracy that turned out to be regulatory, an impossible regulatory blockage, we weren't able to get anything done. So can you tell us a little bit, Ellie, about the role that the abundance argument has played in the debate over the future of the Democratic Party, and how you see the fight between the left, most of which has been instinctively hostile to the idea. But there are people like Ellie, or like Lee Phillips, who is in, I think, our techno-progressive frame, who has argued strenuously that the abundance movement is, in fact, compatible with big social democratic projects. So how do you see that argument right now?
Yeah, I mean, this is something that's come up a whole lot. Abundance has been a big conversation in DC and in the worlds that I'm in over the past, year or two. And personally, and I know many people on the left disagree with me on this, but I see it as an important addition to the conversation. I agree with abundance folks on a lot, not everything, but I agree with them on a lot. I think that we, as Democrats, progressives, have made it in places where we've governed and where we've had the opportunity to show what progressive governing looks like. We've done a whole lot of things wrong. We've made, especially on the place that abundance folks really focus on, we've made it very, very hard to build things, to build housing, to build infrastructure, clean energy projects. And these are things that progressives care about, that the left should care about. And if you care about making sure people have these things, we need to make sure that there is enough supply of those things to meet the demand. So I certainly think that that's an important way of shifting the conversation away from so much of the conversation that we see on the left about process, about procedure. This is a lot of it's a focus on outcome, and I think that's been very helpful. And the idea that scarcity in these basic things that people need, again, housing, even healthcare, it's not natural. It's not just a function of a natural economy. It's political, and it's based on decisions that were made oftentimes by progressives, and what we can do to shift that, to fix that, and to make sure that if we're saying that we believe in a government that could work to help people, we're actually delivering a government that could help to work for people and provide the things that they want. So I think that where techno-progressives diverge from that, I think there's a lot of overlap, but where we diverge in a few ways is in ambition, in how we look at power, and in how we look at some of the values. So if abundance is primarily focused on removing these bottlenecks in the physical economy, zoning, permitting, supply constraints, making sure that we can build more of what we know we need, techno-progressive is focused on something bigger. Our focus is on focusing on something maybe more ambitious. How emerging technologies can be used are going to reshape work, how they're going to reshape power, how they're going to reshape life itself, and how to make sure that we are prepared for that, and how the left is prepared to govern that transformation, not just increase supply of products that we know we need now. So if abundance asks, why can't we build? Techno-progressives ask, who benefits from what we're building? Who decides about what we're building? What can we build that can bring us even more that's different than just increasing the supply of what we know we need now? I think also techno-progressives take a different approach to regulation. I think the abundance movement is more, just starts on the assumption that we need to deregulate. And I think techno-progressives can look at this in a way that says what regulations aren't working. Sure, let's get rid of those. Let's get rid of the dumb regulations. But what other regulations are needed? Not just to make sure we have more supply, but to make sure that that everyone benefits, that the power is in the right hands, that the decisions are being made by the right people. Again, not to slow it down, not to put up procedural hurdles or roadblocks, but to do this right and to make sure that we're increasing supply while also getting the kind of country, society, community that we want. So I think that techno-progressives may say that building more without addressing these power structures, these questions about control, could take us in the wrong direction, could increase inequality, and could do other things that we're not looking for. I think there's a number of other differences that we can go through. I'll stop there, but James, jump in.
Right.
We could dig into anything deeper.
Well, no, just you reminded me of the fact that 6 years ago, I think I published an essay about automating the state, a postmodern governance, and then Doge comes along, and it's like, okay, right idea, wrong implementation, right? There's a lot of things that are bubbling up in our politics that I think we should not instinctively oppose. The ideas of use, and which the Obama administration actually started, of trying to figure out ways of automating government processes. There's huge paper backlogs in non-automated parts of the federal government. So there are many projects like, and the reason I think of this is that the abundance argument has partly been, oh, you're just warmed over deregulation, handouts to the corporate and the real estate lobby and so forth. And it's certainly true that if you dig behind some of the abundance promoters, that there are people like that. But in terms of the policy debate, we have to look beyond, just is this moving in a direct, we have to figure out, is there a progressive way to accomplish things? And China, part of the argument about China, I think we have to put a pin in China this week, but we can talk about China later. But part of the argument about China right now is, look at this wonderful authoritarian government. It does all these benign things, including green energy solutions. It's implementing artificial intelligence and everything. Maybe we need a little bit more of that kind of authoritarianism. So I don't think that the argument for big projects and bold executive power use to promote, to get past the roadblocks of regulatory issues. I don't think that that's necessarily a left or right thing, because you could be, you could be a CCP person, but I think we have to confront that this is the current argument, and it's like, what is the progressive or democratic response? Mateo, you're out there in New Mexico. One of the big issues that is bubbling up, Bernie Sanders is now talking about it, trying to empower, the opposite of what we're talking about with abundance, which is trying to get stuff built, is that the bubbling up from the Democratic left has been, let's stop building AI data centers because they're bad for water and electricity and communities and so forth. And you're right up close to all of that in the Southwest out there. What's your current feeling about the left's response to AI data center issue and what we should be talking about in terms of techno-progressive approach?
Yeah. Can I respond to what Ellie said
Oh, sure,
first?
sure. Yeah.
Um, well, yeah, I think that the abundance argument like James said, was originally an argument of the left. And certainly, as you said with the CCP, and the same could be said about the Soviet Union and other, state socialist countries. I don't think that China's state socialist exactly anymore, but that's another argument. The those regimes always had a very build first engineering mentality, right? As that novel, or not, sorry, that not that novel, the book Breakneck um made the argument of the engineering society has always been at the heart of what state socialism was, right? And it's always what drove it. But there's also the social democratic abundance that really we saw all throughout the whole history of Western Europe and in many other countries around the world, like even in Japan, which has not as vast a social democratic structure as Europe, but
Kind of culturally
building out,
social democratic.
yeah, but building out these really ambitious projects. I mean, the Shinkansen is extremely ambitious. It's one of the best run train systems in the world. They have also one of the most productive housing systems in the world. They produce more housing per capita than almost every other nation.
Just on
So,
high speed rail, by the way, the Shinkansen, wonderful train system, I highly recommend. But China, as you know, has built out the most high speed rail in the entire world. Now, on
mhm.
the one hand, you could say the US has not been able to accomplish anything on high speed rail. Japan has some high speed rail and it works very well. China has built out so much high speed rail that their system is like $1 trillion in debt because they have high speed rail lines that go out to the middle of nowhere, to a podunk. And it's like, between those three, I think there's a techno progressive answer someplace, which is like, we don't want to be such an engineering society where we build instead of think about whether we really need it or not. And we don't want to be the one that can't build anything. We have to be someplace in between. But go ahead.
Yeah, and I think that really you're totally right. I think that that brings up the point of the importance of democracy and of democracy that functions.
Right.
I don't think that the society that we have now, which, in abundance they call it something like proceduralism, is democratic really at all. It's really quite anti-democratic, I think, in a lot of ways. And
The people
it's
can't
not,
see their wishes fulfilled in policy.
yeah, absolutely. It's not really about trying to democratically control production or, to use the Marxist phrase, to steer the social product toward its best use. But I think that many social democracies in the past, I can think of Austria being one of the best examples. In Vienna, they not only had a very democratic way of building housing, which included a lot of decentralized planning and decentralized design that included that, that brought in lots of different people from different neighborhoods and communities to kind of really have a say on what kind of housing was designed. And they built very high quality public housing that's still the envy of the world. You can look at that and say, democracy doesn't necessarily slow down the things that we want, right? And then the things that are called that regulation, right, in proceduralism is not necessarily democratic, right? I think technoprogressivism, it needs to make an argument, and it implicitly makes the argument that the democratic control over the technological development of society is not going to be made democratic by just regulating only, because it's purely really only controlling what already exists and what's coming out of the structure, right? So it's only after, often only after the fact, or it adds an extra layer, right? We need to have this oversight over what tech companies do. We need to have this oversight over biotech or over information tech, right? Instead of thinking more like the way the mid 20th century projects thought, which is democracy needs to be included in the planning of development. And so, of course, that requires a transformation of society in many ways, but we've already seen it. We have lots of examples, as I've
Don't
said
you
with
think
Vienna.
including people in the planning would slow it down even more?
Well, it depends. I mean, I don't think that it would, I don't think that including people, and, it's not every single person on Earth, right? It needs to be included in the planning, obviously. Maybe it's not obvious to people, but the inclusion of people in planning and decentralized planning, I don't think inherently slows everything down. Maybe it's going to be slower than what we're talking about in China. That's true. But we want to mitigate against the negatives that come with building out high-speed rail to small towns when we don't really need it. Right. So speed by itself is not a virtue, and nor is, slowness. Because then we have to, on both ends, we have an enormous amount of cost. If you slow things down with proceduralism, a lot of the, again, to use the technical term, the social product is used in the procedure itself instead of building the thing. On the other hand, you build stuff that we don't really need, so you're wasting labor, enormous amounts of labor, on building stuff that doesn't really need to exist. So, we want to be able to slow down the process enough to make sure we're using things in the right way, but not to allow anybody to stop the process.
Right.
I think proceduralism has this NIMBYist effect where literally any small neighborhood group, any HOA group can say, like, we don't want to build a housing project. And I think that some of these things are positive and they are used positively occasionally. Maybe they'll be used occasionally to go to your question about with AI data centers. We can use NIMBYism to stop these projects, which many workers argue we don't actually need. They're not really going to be necessary to build out LLMs, that it's much better to just build better models and to stop training models the way that the present way that they're training models is like training it on data that is AI and then using past AI to train future models, and that leads to the whole process of AI slop and all this stuff,
Yeah,
which I think is a
I think
technical
there's
question, but
I think there's an AI data center argument separate from the water and electricity resource use, because I think those are actually things that could be technologically addressed. You could have gray water uses, and some of the waters I think has been exaggerated, the water uses, and the electricity, they could build their own plants and so forth. But the idea that we may
yeah.
not need AI data centers, that they may be a Ponzi scheme that NVIDIA and the other big firms have created to invest in each other to build these things that we really don't need. I think that, again, comes from China, the DeepSeek moment. And now China is moving on to DeepSeek technologies, or technologies which use a fraction of the energy and resources that the chips that we're building in the West do. So it may be that technological innovation will make all these unnecessary, in which case we saved the public billions of dollars by saying, don't build these fucking things.
Well, I think that's important because yeah, exactly. I agree that the Southwest has big problems with water and power.
Yeah.
Those are solvable problems. I mean, they're not easy to solve problems. I mean, they're quite sticky problems. They require us to do a lot in transforming the energy and water system. But those problems of transforming the energy and water system are tied to the same problem that data centers face us with, which is the privatization of infrastructure. So, in my view, not only here with Project Jupiter, but many other projects across the country, these are not really about just getting more data processing. They're really about controlling land and about private equity. They're a strategy for producing profitability where profitability has become an increasingly difficult problem in capitalism. Like right now, they're trying to buy our power system in New Mexico, PNM. It's not the only one, but PNM is Albuquerque's power company, and BlackRock is trying to purchase it under a third party and then gut it and resell it as is the strategy of private equity. It is sort of a Ponzi scheme that we've seen in Wisconsin and Minnesota and other states. So that is one strategy. You have a kind of a power system that is kind of failing a bit and it needs a lot of upgrades and there's a lack of capacity on the grid. And so instead of fixing those things and bringing them more into the democratic fold, which is really what I believe as a progressive we need to make the power system public. We need to unify the grid to bring it back under public control, and to really determine what kinds of energy, what the sources of energy are, and how those energy resources are used, what energy is put toward, right? The same with water. That question is the same question as the AI question, the AI data center question, which is who is controlling the flow of data? It's not the people who make the data, right? All of us make the data with our lives, right? There's just insights about how we do things in our lives. And it may very well slow down the process of building AI data centers to bring more people into the fold and to democratize the process, but not just to slow it down for its own sake, right? The reason why NIMBYs are slowing down the process is to save their property value and to spike the cost of property. And there's a lot of reasons tied to industry why that makes sense and why that's a good strategy. And then on the other side, there's producing useless infrastructure. So we don't want to have no data in society, so because data is useful and we can use it to do many good things. It has been captured by various hostile interests like Palantir and Flock for, ICE detention and for immigration enforcement, or it's not even immigration enforcement, so much as kidnapping. But they've been using this technology for that purpose, collecting data for that purpose. Um, but that doesn't mean that we don't need data. We need data for making sure that people live healthy lives, that they have the services they need, and all the rest. And so we want democracy to be robust in delivering those things that we really need and want, and making sure that we don't waste huge amounts of labor, which usually we only see in terms of money, right? We see billions of dollars to build this, and OpenAI said we need $7 trillion to get to AGI. But really behind that $7 trillion is billions of hours of human labor. I mean, people getting up and going to work every day, working very hard to innovate and to create new things, right? You have engineers, you have people who are designers, and they're doing their life's work. And should that life's work be to accomplish something that benefits humanity, or should it be wasted on these schemes?
Right. All of the wealth that's being generated by our technological innovations has been going to the top 1.1%, 0.001%. And so part of that is why? Why is the intellectual property regime such that all of our labor benefits the few and not the many? But the flip side of that is what is the dignity of work, right, Ellie? And I think this is we have many topics that we want to address, but one of them is, can the left imagine a future where work is decentered as the important part of our life, where we consciously use automation and artificial intelligence to change our lives from one of work or die to universal abundance. So, how do you imagine that argument around the dignity of work, which seems to be part of the appeal that at least MAGA used to have for blue collar people?
Yeah, and before I get to that, I do want to talk a little bit about the AI data center piece because I do think this is really important right now, and I've got a different perspective from Matteo. In that, I don't like the way that Bernie Sanders and others are talking about this, and I'm not going to go too deep into the policy here. And do we need data centers? Do we not need data centers? Are they real problems for electricity and water, or are they not? But to me, the thing that I have a big problem with is this can't be the left's response to AI, and that's what it is being framed as right now. That Bernie Sanders and others, they're saying people have fears about AI, we have fears about AI, so our answer is to say stop, is to say pause on data centers. I think more and more people are going to see that LLMs, even as they currently are, and certainly as they're going to be, will improve their lives in many ways. There'll be massive problems, but people will see that it's real, and people will see that there's promise. And I think that we technoprogressives can articulate a vision for how AI and how the automation and everything that comes from it can make their lives better if we do this right, and if the power and the control doesn't just accrue, and the money doesn't just accrue to the top 1% of people who control this. So I don't love the idea of saying just stop. I think we should focus more on shaping it. I also buy the policy, the substantive argument that these data centers are going to be built, the compute is going to come, and we could do it in America where we have much more control over the future, or it's going to happen in China or South America or Southeast Asia where it's cheaper and we're going to have no labor rights, no environmental protections, no control. I'd rather, the United States continue to lead on AI than China take the lead on AI, for example. So that's how I'm thinking about it right now. When it comes to dignity of work, I also, this is something that I think is going to be really important for Democrats to grapple with, and it's something that I think that technoprogressives can have a lot of interesting things to say about. Is that I think that when Democrats go out and talk about the dignity of work, and including many Democrats who I respect and who I think are coming from a good place, they're essentially they're telling people to look at jobs. Many people who have jobs that they don't like, many people who have jobs that are dangerous, many people who have jobs that are not dignified. Every human has dignity, and we shouldn't certainly look down on people who have jobs like that. But I also don't think that we need to glamorize the jobs of the past that many people hate and work hard to either move beyond themselves or have their children move beyond, and that's what they consider to be their dream. And I think to go back to what I said before, historically, Democrats have always talked about progress and moving to better places. And when Democrats sometimes talk about the dignity of work, they'll talk about factory jobs, and they'll talk about jobs, automotive jobs. And again, these jobs, of course, everyone should have dignity, and they're dignified jobs. But there's also dignity in people not having to do jobs they hate, and not having to do jobs that are dangerous, and not having to do jobs that are boring, and where they don't have freedom of their own time or their own schedule. And I think Democrats can offer a vision that's different. We could talk about shorter work weeks. We could talk about universal basic income. We could talk about ways for humans to flourish and have a life that's dignified, that isn't just tied to a job. So I think that is another example of what I see as an older, more conservative way of thinking about our politics, and that we could do better than that. We could offer a better vision for what work could look like, for what life could look like, what the economy could look like, that where dignity isn't just tied to bad jobs.
Yeah. Can I
Go ahead.
respond to that?
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I don't want to say that, just to clarify, um, I wasn't trying to make a blanket argument that we should never build data centers. We already have data centers from before AI, obviously. And, you know, I am of the view that the most I think that the techno-progressive view is that we should, as much as possible, although it's never possible to do this 100%, build systems where labor is on its most advanced basis, right? That we should not waste labor as much as possible. And that, so we don't want to build systems that are going to waste labor because we don't need the data centers. And on the other end, we don't want to say we shouldn't automate because all work is dignified, like you're saying, and then we just end up having people who could have had a different, like whose jobs didn't really need to exist because they don't produce things that advance the social product, doing those jobs, effectively wasting their labor again, which I think is the opposite of dignity. I think that if you're going to be doing work, it should be work that doesn't necessarily advance the productivity of the 1%, right? Which is, I think, the main critique, right? Productivity in that always work sense, that it produces something for the company, right? But that it produces something for yourself, that it produces something for the world, right? That it advances progress in that social and cultural sense, as well as in the, technological sense. We want to ensure always that we make the argument clear that, yeah, work is very good when it's advancing that progress. And that we want to, I think just maybe the verbs are what throws people off, eliminating jobs and, you know, removing redundancies and that sort of thing. I think people hear themselves included in that redundancy and that elimination, which I think is the main thing, which is why James always talks about universal basic income. And I think that, as you're saying, Ellie, one of the main bulwarks against having some people have an enormous amount of labor, more labor than they really should ever have to shoulder, and other people not even being able to get jobs, is building a project to revive the shorter work week, the shorter work day, longer vacations. At least we could, in the United States, get to the level that they have in France. I mean, this was achieved like 60, 70 years ago. And that would mean that there is less time that you have to spend at work, which means that it can be divvied up more effectively. And you don't have to have some people working 60 hours and other people that don't have enough work, where not having work means that you don't get anything to eat. You don't have a place to live, right? I think that's an extremely important part of the labor movement and always was, until very recently, which was to argue constantly for the shortening of work hours and to reduce that kind of drudgery and mundane work. I think
And
for
expand the
at least
social
the first
wage.
100 years.
Yeah, expand the social wage so that people
Social
don't have,
wage, yeah.
yeah, don't have economic precarity. When it comes to the dignity of work, I always bring up my wife because she's a pottery teacher. And probably for 10,000 years, we've had specialist potters in every village and then industrial pottery that made pots better, faster, and cheaper than any individual potter could. But people still want to learn to pot, and then they enjoy potting. And my wife enjoys teaching potting. And I think that that's my vision of what the future of human meaning looks like. It's like if we were to enact a law that said no one can do industrial potting anymore, we all have to buy individually handcrafted pots. We'd say that's stupid. Don't do that. And the people who were on those assembly lines then trying to make handcrafted pots would feel this is stupid. A machine could do this so much better. And that's the situation we're in. It's like, okay, I understand that you were trained for 30 years to do a particular job and that it's hard for you to imagine what your life is going to be like if you don't do that job. But doesn't it feel meaningless to do that job when this robot can do it better, faster, and cheaper than you can? Why would we make a law that says that has to be the only way to do it? So I think that that's the situation we're in, and we have to convince people that there are more things to human life, and you don't have to be poor in that future that we imagine beyond necessary labor.
Yeah, and that's what requires the planning, right? Like,
Yeah.
if we don't have democratic control over the planning of society, and again, I mean it in a decentralized sense, not in the Soviet sense, that if people cannot meaningfully determine And I know you've said it before, James, that we don't want to have it at the only at the sectoral or at the workplace level because people are very specific in their own interests in that at that level. We want to have it on this large
The
national
Palantir workers
national
think we
level.
really need Palantir.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
I mean, even if they're against Palantir,
Yeah.
they still want to have a job because that is how they pay their rent. That's how they get the things they need to live. So we need to determine at a society-wide level how we want to redirect labor, right? If we're not going to have these jobs here, what are we going to do? If so many people are going to be then unemployed, we can't, any just society would not say, let's eliminate coal mining, let's not have truck drivers. And well, those people, if they can't figure out what to do, then well, that's too bad. That's just progress, which I think is what it's not what I think. It is what has happened in the past. And people rightfully, as you said, with the Luddites are like, well, I mean, this society does not have a mechanism for us to come together and say, look, truck driving, maybe there's maybe some, we're going to need a lot less truck drivers if we have automated trucks. We're not there yet, but say in a decade, we might
Close.
be.
We're close.
Yeah, I have no idea. I'm not an expert on AI or automation, but I could say when we get there, which I think it's a when, we don't want truck driving is extremely hard on the body and on the mind, and it's also hard on families. You have to be separated from your family like all week usually, and you're not sleeping, and it's very hard job actually. It's
And dangerous. They're on the road a long time.
dangerous. Driving is one of the most dangerous things you can do in our society. So okay, we're going to have less truck drivers, but what are we going to do with truck drivers? And where is that savings of the
5 million truck drivers in the United States.
yeah, what we're going to make this huge savings in the social product, right? So we have all this labor we were using on truck driving. Where is it going to be reinvested? Is it going to be reinvested in the stock returns of people who own the large companies, which is traditionally what's happened? People look at it who are in these industries, people in labor and in unions look at it. The Teamsters are the largest union. My dad was a Teamster. And they say, well, this is only going to benefit the rich. So we're going to fight for our jobs, because there's no other way, right? We have to make another way to say,
Which is, I think, a techno-progressive point
can,
about the labor movement is that the way that we can help the labor movement adopt and incorporate a technological future into their own vision is by saying, look, there's something other than just the rich get the benefits of this, you lose your job. There's a vision forward about how labor can be empowered and labor can still be meaningful, but we also get this automation from it.
yeah. And insofar as there's jobs left for truck driving, instead of having to drive 60 hours a week, you drive 30 hours, right? Instead of people, if we don't need people cleaning toilets anymore because there's robots to do these kinds of jobs, then if the entire social product is redistributed toward other things that we do need, and there's just a vast number of things that we do need that because of the way our society is set up are not even calculated in the economic question because they're not profitable, but we certainly need them. We do need to do a lot to repair the ecosystems. We need to do a lot to repair communities. People are lonely and depressed, and there's just, if it's not profitable to solve these problems, it's not done. But we can decide, not easily, but I think, it's something that we could push as a large project, right? I think it's part of this democratic socialist project to say these things that are big problems, solving addiction and suicide, right? I mean, how many tens of thousands of people die every year of suicide? How little is being done to solve these problems, right? So if we're saving all this labor because of AI and all this other stuff, well, maybe we can redistribute that labor, not the exact same people necessarily, but the whole of society can decide, no, these are problems that we need to solve. And so let's spend our labor doing this. That's what dignity, I think, is composed of, is that our labor is being used to build the worlds we want. not only to often people literally go to work and they're like, yeah, I'm happy to have this job because I need it to survive and my kids need it to like eat, but I don't do anything meaningful. I'm just moving numbers around on a spreadsheet and making PowerPoints about
Bullshit
the
jobs.
metrics of an advertisement or something, and
Yeah.
that's silly. I mean, we want people to get paid for that job,
Right.
but
Having a conversation about
better another way.
what kind of work we should actually be doing, I think is something, there's certain kinds of work that we shouldn't be doing. But your point about where the wealth goes, I think one of the things about this moment, and let's make this the last topic because we've got many things that we want to talk about in the future: military industrial complex, clinical trials, et cetera, the electrical grid. But I think one of the things about this particular political moment is that these tech elites, these tech oligarchs who have risen, are for the most part, and let's say Bill Gates, although we now know he's a perv and has a lot of other problems. He did create one of the best charities in the world. So there are a couple examples of wealth oriented charities like the robber barons of the 19th century who finally got whacked by antitrust and then poured a lot of money into the different philanthropies to build churches and hospitals and whatnot around the country. But these particular tech oligarchs have not turned towards noblesse oblige right yet. And there's a growing but they're so concentrated and they're so in bed and so visibly corrupt with the current administration. Ellie, I want you to just respond. To what extent is the whole techno-progressive project just going to be a tiny, tiny footnote to the growing anger and slapback against the excesses of the tech oligarchs?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I think that's an important part of what we're doing is I don't think the backlash is there, and the left and many people across the country are increasingly aware and angry about what big tech is doing, the money, the control, and I think that's only going to get worse as technology continues to advance and control more and more of our lives. I see that as like I see an important part of this project, of the Techno-Progressive project, being not allowing that backlash to come in the form of Luddism and to say that we just need to stop tech and that we just need to roll back the clock. I see the Techno-Progressive project as being about taking that energy, that backlash, that anger, that interest in making change and understanding that the world has changed and we need to make big changes to accommodate that, and directing that in a more productive path, one that understands that we can control this technology, that we should have.
Part of that requires
Mhm.
politically decentering their wealth, right? So, I mean, to what extent do you think our message should address the need to have progressive taxation that directly addresses the growing accumulation of wealth, but also the structure of power that they've created within their firms? Some people have argued that the data centers should in fact be public utilities instead of privately owned, for instance. Do you have
Yeah,
a thought about that yet?
yeah. I mean, certainly on the taxation front, I think that's core to the progressive message generally, techno-progressive and
Yeah.
not. And I think that's something that's important. The inequality, accumulation of wealth and power, dark money. We're going to see in this election cycle and,
Citizens
and certainly
United.
in 2028. Exactly. And we're seeing all of these big tech companies pour hundreds of millions of dollars into campaigns to elect their preferred candidates. So yeah, I think that's going
The
to
next
be
president of the
it's going
United
to be a
States might be JD
yeah,
Vance, might be a wholly owned
yeah,
subsidiary of Teal Incorporated.
absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we are going to continue to have these conversations amongst ourselves, and we will share some of those with you. But also, the plan for this particular podcast and channel, Techno Progressive Hub, is that we're going to have a lot of guests on to talk about these topics from different points of view. People to talk about ecology and the military and clinical trials and longevity dividend and all the things that we've laid out for the last year as part of the policy agenda that we want to discuss. But thank you for joining us today, Ellie, and we'll have you guys back soon to talk about other things. But any final thoughts, Ellie?
No, thank you, James. I think this has been a good conversation. I'm looking forward to more ahead.
And Mateo?
Yeah, I think yeah, it was a very good conversation, and yeah, I look forward to digging into the kind of nuts and bolts of and the case studies of how alternatives have already been carried out, both in past technological forms, as you said, data centers as utilities is a good example. And we've talked about having the public internet, running the internet as a public utility. It would have to be, many of these would have to be global projects, which is a, big haul, obviously. But there are many examples from the past of seemingly chaotic, ruthless origins of many technologies that have been brought under public control and have become the most seminal progressive projects of all time. And I think when I think about them a lot, I was editing a podcast that for Bread and Robots that I'm gonna put out soon. It's a couple months overdue now. But I was talking to Marc Roux from the French Transhumanist Party, and we were thinking about the origins of the railroad. I mean, now we see Amtrak, we see all of these high-speed rail networks, and most progressives agree that this is something that we should build, and it's not a 100%, progressive goal at all times. There are some reasons, like you said, with China, why we don't just want to build rail everywhere all the time without thinking about it. But in that time period when the railroad was originally built, it was one of the most ruthless industries ever created. And the men that controlled it, like Vanderbilt and Carnegie with the steel rails, were, very similar to the men who control the tech industry. And that was the leading technology of the time, and they absolutely destroyed people's lives to build it. They cleared land, they used the military.
Aggressive use of eminent domain and
Oh,
steamrolling of NIMBYism, local NIMBYism.
yeah, it's just the things they did to build the railroad were obscene. I mean, really, if you look at the history of it. And
And the robber barons then used their wealth to lobby the state in ways that are very similar to what's happening today. And the answer in that case was antitrust, right? And so,
antitrust and bringing them under public control, right? They're publicly planned mostly,
yeah,
most of the world today.
yeah.
And in Europe now, we're thinking like, how do you build a rail system that, all the gauges of all the rail systems, they were all incompatible at one time because they're all built by private companies, just like the New York subway system has that legacy, which is why some of the trains don't run on other rails and other boroughs and why you can't have a really fully integrated system in New York because it used to be all private companies. Thinking about how we transform that into a fully integrated system that just works so well. Like when you see the newer systems, again, to bring it to China, it's because they built it all in one gauge and all in one system that it just goes everywhere. It's always on time, more or less. And bringing it under public control tames that chaos and additionally allows so much more to be built, right? And in a way that is much more accountable to the public, not in the Chinese case necessarily, but
This is this could be an excellent topic for us to discuss going forward. The role of the state in setting the standards that allow for the next stage of technological innovation. My brother-in-law works at NIST, and I've always seen that as NIST's job is like, okay, this is what a pound is. This is what this is what a millimeter is. That was the beginning of the kind of standards that were necessary for commerce in the modern world. And so in the same way, we need to have the standard setting for the artificial intelligence age and for the biotech age in order to move forward. You can't have 5 million patents on every single gene in the human body and expect biomedicine to come out of that, right? So you need to have some way past the thicket. But anyway, let's talk about that in a future topic. And thank you guys for joining me today. And I'm really looking forward to us working on the Technoprogressive Hub project.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks, James. Thanks.
The Technoprogressive Hub is sponsored by the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies and hosted by me, Jay Hughes. Find us at Substack at Technoprogressives.